opening debate. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Here, bravo. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleagues here. I rise in this House today to speak on Bill C-5, an act to amend the Criminal Code and Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And I've listened to voices on all sides of this House, from members whom I've known and worked with, and I hear a conflicting difference in the connection between crime and sentencing, crime and punishment, as Fyodor Dostoevsky would say. I hear from some friends and colleagues in this House that there is no connection between longer mandated prison sentences and the rate of recidivism in society and the rate of crime increasing in Canada. I hear the other side that clearly illustrates the connection between the length of time mandated for a specific crime and the reduction in criminal offences of that nature. Further, I've listened to the government speakers on the legislation, and I hear a familiar refrain from those on the government bench, as in all things, that this bill will let society have its cake and eat it too at the same time. As in, there are no real choices to make here. There are real choices. Somewhere in the sea of data and information, there is obvious narrative, all of which cannot be completely factual. That is, all these facts cannot live in the same narrative. I will deviate a little here because I've seen this much from this Attorney General of Canada, playing fast and loose with the facts and trying to make the facts fit his narrative when examination clearly shows the insincerity of his statements. With this cacophony of facts, statements, theories, postulations, and yes, misstatements, I took the liberty of examining my own pre-established beliefs in the connection between crime and punishment. Now, life is a good teacher, and I remember a time in our history when society was less safe. Murders were more common, criminal activity was growing. There were parts of our cities across North America where people ventured at their own peril. Some brave politicians in the United States, to lead us, started implementing a program known as broken windows at the time. In short, if you prosecute small crimes to the utmost, the perpetrators understand the consequences of crime and do not drift into more serious crimes. The effect over years was a reduction of crime in the cities. Places became safe again. People moved back downtown in large cities. Social problems abated. People knew where they stood in the eyes of the law again. We are far from that in our current society. In fact, we are moving quickly in the opposite direction. I walk to work, and it is obvious over the past 2.5 years that there is more crime on the streets of Ottawa and on the streets of Calgary. We can go over the statistics, but at this point, they are redundant. The connection between the proliferation of severe drug abuse and street crime is clear, as is the increase in mental health problems amongst those at-risk people. And yet the government wants the criminals who have preyed on these people, these poor people in our society, pushing more of them onto the street and outside of the care they require, pushing them further towards the final outcome that the proliferation of drugs like fentanyl lead to, that is untimely death, to receive lighter sentences. I try and resolve these clear inconsistencies being offered by various narrative constructors on all sides, and I think it's healthy to overcome what might be confirmation bias, something I used to deal with in my previous profession. And that is the propensity to accept data that confirms one's own preconceived opinions on any given matter. The source of data I found to be instructive was from Public Safety Canada, and the report was entitled 2019 Corrections and Conditional Release Statistical Overview. So I used the government's own source to determine which information was fact, as we know it, and which is narrative fiction. And the report clearly shows that Canada's federal incarceration rate has declined from 2009 to 2019, from 117 people per 100,000 Canadians in 2009, down to 107 people per 100,000 Canadians in 2019, a 9% reduction over a decade. Now, there are many other touch points, and I know that correlation and causation are not necessarily the same thing, but something clearly was going right during the period when mandatory minimums were enforced. I like to believe I'm a rational thinker, and the notion of what drives people to the choice of criminal activity as a means to earn living is, like all things, a measure of pros and cons. The common phrase, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. The assessment of return, and with the proliferation of the misery that is a trait of the trade in hard drugs, is greater than the assessed cost of being caught in that trade, the logical choice, outside of absolute shame, is to make that calculation. Make millions of dollars illegally and visit absolute misery upon society's most vulnerable, with an assessed chance of imprisonment of, say, 20%. That is, 1 in 5 perpetrators of this death and destruction will get caught and serve time for committing that crime. That punishment had better suit that crime. So the calculation of the risk versus return needs to be punitive, very punitive. In contradiction to my colleagues that have spoken in favor of lowering sentences, the cost needs to include the shame of being removed from loved ones and communities. These crimes impact our society significantly. There should be no free pass for the consequences, particularly when those consequences are so unequally shared by our Canadian society. We cannot normalize crime. What are these costs? Addiction, rehabilitation, property crime, violent crime, and death. The dismantling of the social contract that binds us as a society taking care of each other. Removing these consequences for tearing down society will accelerate dire outcomes. Now, let's address the inequities that the government hangs its virtue hat on in every speech it gives about this bill. That Canadians of certain ethnicities are overrepresented in our prisons. That fact is true, sadly, and it bears out in the statistics. And it is not getting better. Let's revisit my previous comments on what drives rational people to attempt to profit from criminal activity. An assessment that the return is higher than the risk. Crime is a big business. Where do criminal organizations, those making millions moving fentanyl and other destructive drugs through our cities, get their foot soldiers? I looked at a study, it was an American study, that examined factors correlating with recidivism. A clear correlation with lower recidivism was education level. This legislation will tilt the scales back towards forcing Canadians in marginalized communities to make choices early in life that will remove their future opportunities. It is doing exactly the opposite of what the government seems to pretend it is intended to do. I also want to draw upon clear data, and that is that crime committed by Canadians in minority communities is inordinately committed against Canadians in their own communities. Sadly, crime is a local activity. Thus, the legislation reduces the legitimacy of the victims in those minority Canadian communities in the eyes of the law. If we are tilting the law to avoid incarceration from certain minorities, we are penalizing those same minority Canadians who no longer have the same legal protection as other Canadians. It is discrimination, and it will lead to more unequal outcomes in society. Surely, we can do better. Lastly, I will comment on the ability of judges to interpret what minimum sentences should be delivered. Judges are human beings, bringing their own outlooks and emotions to their job. They are not perfect. They are not social workers, and having appeared in court and having heard judges at committee here in Parliament, I am certain the outcomes they decide are also imperfect. Yes, we have an imperfect judicial system, but perhaps it is less imperfect than other judicial systems. Let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good, as we say. That being said, we need to recognize the limits of what we expect judges to do. As much as they believe they could decide all matters, it's our job as parliamentarians to clearly decide for society what are the consequences of certain crimes. We will hear examples where mandatory sentences are absurd. All rules have exceptions. There's already much leeway in sentencing for crimes before our judiciary. Let's not put them in a position where they are responsible for societal outcomes for which we, parliamentarians, are responsible. This is an attempt by some of my colleagues to delegate their responsibilities to appointed judges. I would ask them why. Society, our constituents, have elected us to decide these issues, and as the pendulum of issues swings, we will see again that Canadians will demand their cities and communities be safe, and they will demand it from their elected, responsible representatives. We cannot delegate this responsibility. I know where my constituents stand on this issue. I know the clarity I have heard in meetings and I've had with citizens and communities as they have seen the significant rise in drug-related crime. Mandatory minimum determination is our job. Let's not dumb down Parliament by delegating this important function to others. We are responsible.
Here, here.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I really appreciated my honourable colleague's speech. It was really fascinating, and it triggered a memory of mine of Michael Sheehan's book, Crush the Cell, How to Defeat Terrorism Without Terrorizing or Defeating Ourselves. I might got the title wrong, but he talks about inside that book an aspect of cleaning up crime in New York. And when they went after the subways, cleaned up the graffiti, cleaned up those lower crimes, just how that actually lowered crime writ large. So if you could just explain, sorry, Madam Speaker, if the member could please explain just a little bit more about the broken windows concept and just that idea of how it's important to nip this in the bud right away and deal with criminals at that early stage before they escalate to those more violent crimes. Thanks, Madam.
Member for Calgary Centre.
I thank my colleague for the comment, and he's right. I remember decades ago going to New York City, and the city he refers to, which is where they implemented broken windows theory first of all, and the crime in the street, the city was unsafe. You walk down, there was crime everywhere, and the new mayor came in and said we need to start taking care of this. Broken windows was the theory he followed, where he basically started enforcing against small crime, and once small crime disappeared, like breaking windows, like graffiti, like getting involved with gangs, you recruit these people at young ages, and once they grow up, once they get older, they continue in that realm of activity. And that's what it nipped in the bud. When you actually say stop here, it stops. And you no longer have people progressing through criminal organizations. It worked. New York became very much a beautiful city to visit, had a whole bunch of tourism opportunities in addition to the other activities that were in the city. So I thank him again for that, and I hope we can talk about that further.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Shefford.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son discours et comme on l'a déjà souvent nommé, et ma collègue l'a nommé précédemment, c'est le contexte aussi qu'on peut peut-être remettre en question pour le dépôt de ce projet de loi-là, dans un contexte où il y a une hausse des crimes par arme à feu. Hier, on voyait 173 femmes et filles ont été tuées l'an dernier, seulement en 2021 au Canada. C'est énorme. Et là, ce qui fait qu'on mélange le projet de loi C-21, comme on l'a dit sur les armes à feu, et celui-ci. Et on mélange des crimes graves d'armes avec des consommations simples de drogue. Alors, on est en train de tout mêler, de faire différents amalgames douteux. Et comment ce serait important de faire quand même une différence entre ces deux projets de loi-là et entre aussi ce qu'on appelle des crimes par arme à feu et aussi la question des possessions simples de drogue. Donc, simplifier tout ça, mais le contexte étrange dans lequel ce projet de loi-là est déposé.
Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Je remercie mon collègue pour la question ici à la Chambre de la Commune. Le projet de loi C5, c'est sur j'ai fait commentaire sur le crime de drogue sur mon discours, mais il y a des autres crimes des armes à feu qui sont importants aussi dans le projet de loi. L'autre projet de loi qu'elle a référé, c'est un projet de loi pour les armes à feu. Je pense que la plupart sont ciblés à des personnes qui ont les armes à feu qui sont légales maintenant. Mais ça, si ça c'est le problème, on verra. Mais est-ce qu'il y a... C'est dommage qu'il y a des crimes contre les femmes et les armes à feu qui sont en cause de les crimes comme ça sont... je pense que si sont armes à feu sont illégales, je pense que c'est les crimes des armes à feu illégales il faut qu'on adresse dans la société canadienne. Merci.
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his speech. You brought a lot of, dignity to the conversation, and I really appreciate that. I was just wondering if you could comment quickly through you, Madam Chair, about the issue around the Court of Appeal for Ontario upholding a ruling that struck down the mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years imprisonment for the S286.32 of the Criminal Code as being inconsistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I wonder if you could comment on that specific situation. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
There's a lot of courts of appeal that strike down laws in Canada, and I think we have to take a look at where the Charters of Rights and Freedoms are. If it actually, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is expressed in the Ontario Court of Appeal, and I apologize to my colleague because I'm not sure where that stands in the appeal process from the Ontario Court of Appeal to potentially the Supreme Court of Canada. But it is one of those things where different courts of appeal do have certain rights where they say, okay, this is contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then of course it goes up to the higher court of appeal, which is the Supreme Court of Canada. And I apologize, I can't give her more detail on it at this point in time, being unfamiliar with where it is in the process.
Resuming debate, the honourable member